My name is Jonathan Dent and I am Green Corridors Manager at St Nick's Environmental Charity. Green Corridors, they are anything that allows wildlife to travel, to forage, to live and to connect with other habitats. Back gardens play a vital role really in our cities, in our towns, in our villages, especially where we've got less of the natural habitat available and things are depleted. They are where a lot of our urban wildlife is found. Lots of species use the gardens to move around for water sources, for food sources. Gardens make up a big space for nature. We might have hedgerows, we might have wildflowers in our gardens. They may not always be native, but they might attract pollinators. We may have ponds that amphibians move around from garden to garden. Holes in the fences for hedgehogs to move around, and for the bird species as well, and the food there for the winter birds and for our resident birds as well. We're actually losing garden spaces in a lot of areas. So those people who do have gardens still, if things can be put aside, areas left a little bit wilder for nature, have you got space for a pond to be put in? Can you put in a few wildflowers? It's little bits that can make a really big difference and can have a big difference to us as well. It could be fruit trees, edible things that also are good for wildlife. New housing developments, obviously they're needed, but they can be done in a really good way. Yes, it would be better if it was still a really nice habitat and there for wildlife, but we can make housing developments that still think about nature, still think about what they can do for wildlife. Bee houses, bat boxes, putting in areas of meadow and grassland that aren't just amenity cut, thinking about the tree species that are going in, being native where they can. And yes, people are going to have gardens and there's going to be planters that need to look neat and tidy, but that doesn't mean that they can't be pollinator friendly or wildlife friendly as well. There needs to be consideration obviously about water and where the water goes from these developments. Is it all going to then go into a beck or the river? There's interesting things now that can be done with that water in terms of balancing ponds to capture the water that are actually really valuable habitats in development. Yeah, nature reserves are often the hubs almost for wildlife. That's then an opportunity to think about, well, what is the wildlife in that area? And then what are the connections to and from that hub or that nature reserve? So if we take nature reserves in York, for example, they make up a tiny amount of the green space within the city. If we just concentrated on them, they're almost islands. We're fragmenting that habitat and the species that are there. So without the connections for species to move between sites from those nature reserves, there just becomes more pressure on those sites from surrounding areas, and that means the wildlife is suffering. Railways, they are corridors. Are they green corridors? Yeah, they probably are. There's trees along them, there's plants along them, there's some really interesting wildflowers that can be found along them that just grow in the gravel and things like that. And mammals and bird species will use them as corridors. Bats will use them as corridors as well, linear corridors to move around. Obviously the downside of that is wildlife being able to cross, and those railways can be and are a real barrier for wildlife moving from one space to the other. There's probably more that can be done. Nature bridges would be really good, wildlife bridges, where we've got a certain species that is stuck on one side of a motorway, one side of a railway, whether it's a tunnel, whether it's a bridge, but things allowing nature to move around where we've got these barriers as well. Most farmland isn't particularly wildlife friendly. And I think the main issue is the over-intensification of farming. And most farming used to be small parcels of fields, hedgerows around them, standard trees, and that's just expanded and it just got big fields and it's maybe managed for crops. And yes, we need food, but there's a much better approach in terms of regenerative farming. But it's all a balance, and there's so much pressure on farmers to make a living it's just such a tricky issue. But there are really good examples where new generations of farmers are coming in and really thinking about how things can be done a little bit differently. Older farmers as well who are actually thinking, yeah, I used to see this species on my farm and I've not seen them for a while, and actually starting to make changes for the good for wildlife as well. Most of the time it does come down to money, so if there's a scheme available that can compensate the farmer for putting some land aside to create an arable verge, to put in trees, to rotationally manage crops so the soil isn't as degraded, hollows in the land which used to be a pond, and again that intensification of farming has meant they've been dried out and then used for crops instead. So reinstating some of those ponds and those networks of water across the farmland can be really important. Woodlands are places where there's different light that comes down at different days, there's different sounds, the trees block the sound out sometimes as well, and just hearing the bird species every now and again. So in terms of almost slowing down a little bit and taking things in, I think woodlands are just the best place just to go for a walk and just listen, look, watch and see what's there. Woodlands need to be managed. Some trees need to come down sometimes, but that doesn't always have to be a negative thing, and it can be part of regenerating the woodland, opening up space. So it's not just closed canopy trees, but there's areas of open space, of different wildflowers that are growing, which then bring in different species into the woodland as well. But that brings opportunity for communities to get involved in that management, and I think that only brings positive things for people, because the more you understand about something, the less you'll be upset if a tree is being cut down, if you understand why it is and it's actually benefiting this species. Allotments can be really valuable, where you've got lots of fruit trees, hedgerows, mature ponds, things like that, which a lot of the older sites have. There is bits that are always going to be put aside and aren't worked on. Bits of grassland that comes through, piles of dead wood that species are using. And the fact that they're often within urban areas, a collection of allotments is a green space that things can move around in. So they can be a real refuge and a food source for wildlife. So there can be really valuable sites along our rivers which support different wildlife. Obviously we're in York, we've got our famous tansy beetle, which is mainly found on the River Ouse. That species survives on our rivers because they're managed in a certain way and because they flood as well. So tansy is their main food species, the tansy plant, and that's a species which needs constant disturbance for the seeds to kind of spread and it to maintain in that area. If the Ouse didn't flood, there wouldn't be any tansy because it would be overgrown by other more vigorous species. So we wouldn't then have tansy beetle. Parks play a part in nature recovery and green corridors. Rowntree Park is a really good example. The park itself and the friends of who manage it, they're battling the floods every year that destroy a lot of the bedding plants and certain species that aren't suitable for being on a floodplain. But one thing that's happened in the last few years is the Friends of group have been really good in embracing the fact it is always going to flood and thinking about, well actually, we're going to plant species that survive in the flooding. We're going to plant tree species and wildflowers that we don't need to replant every year. And those species are probably ones that are naturally going to be found along the rivers and the floodplains anyway, and that can only be a good thing for wildlife rather than the bedding plants and the non-natives. It's a well-used park. They want to keep their footpaths, their playing areas, but there's always space where there can be areas that are put aside for wildlife. Traditionally, cemeteries are very good for wildlife. People are visiting those cemeteries, people want to pay their respects. They can't be just left to be completely wild. But traditionally, they would have been managed by hand with hand scythes. And that management style just creates opportunities for wildlife. We're not just clearing all of the grassland in one go. There would probably be a team of volunteers going and doing bits of scything at different times through the summer, which allowed different species to thrive as well. Things are starting to change a little bit as well in some of those overmanaged cemeteries where they're thinking we need to put a bit of space over for wildlife, and maybe it doesn't need cutting as intensively, the grassland around the site. Maybe we used to have a hedgerow here and we got rid of it. Can we try and reinstate that hedgerow? And there's often trees in a lot of cemeteries as well, so you are getting that mosaic of habitats, having in one area a few or enough different habitats so you're supporting lots of different species rather than it just being grassland or just being woodland or just being wetland. St Nicholas Fields has got a really interesting history. The name actually comes from a grazing fields for a monastery hundreds of years ago. Then over time, housing has built up around it, created by digging out the clay where St Nicholas Fields is, so it became a brickyard. And when then that closed down, the natural thing was for it to become a landfill site at the time, which then closed down in the 70s. There was a period then of the site restoring itself. This site, which was once a landfill site, was now supporting all these different species. There was grasses and wildflowers, different bird species, and then in the kind of 90s onwards, trees were planted, wildflowers were sown, grasses were sown, and that then has developed into what we see today, supporting over 2,600 species, which is pretty amazing. We've got this really wildlife-rich site surrounded by housing and industry. It's a really key site for nature being able to travel from the city out into the countryside, further into the city to other sites.